Any book specifically for funny, bizarre, or otherwise wacky instances which happened in wars? The Home Guard of Britain by Charles Graves contains some funny and serious shit. One man noted for his slowness is grasping a subject. After having fired his first dummy number 36 grenade from discharger, in all sincerity looked quite aghast when he could not find the grenade in discharger after firing same. Furthermore, on being asked to return his empty case, Ballistite said, "I canna, as I've just fired it." On an exercise, I asked a man guarding a closed road what his job was. He said he didn't know. The following then took place. "Who put you here?" "Don't know, sir." "Who is your platoon sergeant?" "Don't know, sir." "Who is your platoon officer?" "Don't know, sir." "Who is your company commander?" "Don't know, sir." "Who am I?" "Don't know, sir." "How long have you been in the company?" 3 months, sir." "How often do you drill?" 5 nights a week, sir." He was discharged later as mentally deficient. One night in 1941, Peter Brown, aged 18, was a member of the guard at a works in the district. A heavy raid occurred at about 9 p.m. A message was telephoned to the works calling for Brown because of serious trouble at his home. Brown asked for and received permission to be relieved from the NCO of the guard. On reaching his home, the private found that both of his parents had been killed and his sister seriously injured by a direct hit. He assisted in disposing of the casualties and collected what few valuables he could from the wreckage of his home. These tasks completed, he returned to duty without delay, reporting back to the NCO of the guard. He completed his normal guard duties for the remainder of the night in spite of the considerable numbing shock he had received. Another volunteer, an old man wearing an ancient uniform of the Great War and carrying a Ross rifle, a relic of the same, was challenged on how he would deal with the Hun paratrooper. He responded by chambering a single cartridge and shooting a crow flying overhead. Exit questioner and crow, the former abashed, the latter bashed. The scene was the orderly room at B Company's HQ of the 23rd Battalion. A woman walked in and demanded to see the OC. This she was allowed to do, and she said that she had come to see him about her husband. "Madam," explained the OC, "your husband has to do his parades and guard duty like every other member of the company." "I am quite sure of that," was the woman's reply. "What I have come to see you about is to try and get you to make him do more parades and guards." Another story is told by a sergeant major who was giving a demonstration of AA fire. He told his platoon they would have better results if they waited until the dive bomber got within at least 1,000 feet from the ground. "Would it be advisable to fix bayonets?" was one of the first questions directed at him. The sergeant major, for the first time in his life, was struck speechless. "You can't make this shit up. It's like K, but 90 years ago. Alas, this is not an easy book to find." The Hinge Factor: How Chance and Stupidity Have Changed History by Eric Dershmead. Spike Milligan's books on World War II. Later in life, he was a radio DJ and entertainer, was a gunner in the British Army, and wrote some hilarious shit about his war experience. Even his book titles are top keck. Mussolini: His Part in My Downfall. Excerpt: A voice is calling across the land. "Bombardier Milligan! Bombardier Milligan is dead," I replied in a disguised voice. The voice replied, "Then he's going to miss his breakfast." World War II, Casablanca Conference. Churchill got in the habit of walking down the beach after hours, smoking while he pondered the day's negotiations. One day wanders further than ever, goes outside the secure perimeter, and runs into a guard. Said guard is an American private on his first deployment of the war. He is determined but green as grass. "Halt! Who goes there?" "It is I, the Prime Minister of the British Empire," Churchill replies affably enough, being a former soldier himself. "No, you ain't." "Well, yes, I am." This goes on in the same vein for a minute or two, with this private from bumfuck nowhere refusing to believe the leader of 1/3 of the entire Allied coalition just randomly wandered up on in the dark. The GI gets more and more frustrated. Finally, he screams out, "Sergeant of the Guard, I got a fella that says he's the Prime Minister of England, and I think he's a goddamn liar." Sergeant runs up, Shines flashlight. Sees soldier. Sees Churchill. Oh shit face. Many abject apologies are made. Never happen again. Churchill was a chap about it. Shared some of his smokes. Wandered off. History does not record what happened to Private Snuffy afterwards. From Army at Dawn by Rick Atkinson. His World War II histories are full of these hilarious antecedents. I remember reading about how a boxer decided to climb on top of a Panzer IV and beat up the commander, then the crew surrendered in Normandy, 44. This is from the Stratagemata by Sextus Julius Frontius. Melanthus, the Athenian general, on one occasion came out for combat in response to the challenge of the king of the enemy, Xanthus, the Boeotian. As soon as they stood face to face, Melanthus exclaimed, "Your conduct is unfair, Xanthus, and contrary to our agreement, I am alone. But you have come out with a companion against me." When Xanthus wondered who was following him and looked behind, Melanthus dispatched him with a single stroke, as his head was turned away. Literally the oldest trick in the book. Mustache size matters in the old Ottoman world. One of the greatest Ottoman sultans had mustaches so long they had to be tied behind his neck while he fought. And in the tragic last scene of the Montenegrin national epic, a companion says to the dying hero, "Let me lift up your mustaches so that I can see the wound in your chest." The neat mustaches on these statues of Saddam were the size of surfboards. On the upper walls outside the dining areas were proverbs in Arabic, worked in marble. One ran, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Saddam Hussein." For me, it's that time during World War II that U.S. servicemen cucked Aussies so hard that it caused a riot. The Battle of Brisbane. U.S. military pay was considerably higher than that of the Australian military, and U.S. dress uniforms were seen as more attractive than those of the Australians. The U.S. Army provided silk stockings and candy to American troops, which they handed out to Australian women, as well as U.S. Army rations, at a time when Australians were on a poor diet due to rationing of food to civilians. This resulted in U.S. servicemen not only enjoying success in their pursuit of the few available women, but also led to many Americans marrying Australian women. Facts greatly resented by the Australians. In mid-1942, a reporter walking along Queen Street counted 152 local women in company with 112 uniformed Americans, while only 31 women accompanied 60 Australian soldiers. By the time the violence had been quelled, one Australian soldier was dead and hundreds of Australians and U.S. servicemen were injured. Something similar happened in the Battle of the Bulge. A sergeant was guarding a road when a jeep rolled up with a bunch of guys in British uniforms. Having been warned about infiltrators in Allied uniforms, he asked for their identification. But the man in the passenger's seat says, "I'm Bernard Montgomery. You can let us through." Sergeant says, "No, sir. There's been infiltrators. You need to show ID or you'll have to be detained." The British man gets annoyed and after going back and forth a bit, orders his driver to go through the roadblock, at which point the sergeant shoots out his tires and demands they all get out. That's when the sergeant finally got their IDs and found he really had just opened fire on Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery and his aides. The narwhal incident makes for a funny section in Sea Harrier over the Falklands. For context, the narwhal was an Argentine factory trawler turned spy ship mostly crewed by fishermen. Some Sea Harriers found it while carrying bombs fused for medium-level attacks so they wouldn't go off at low level. Despite that, they managed to disable the trawler by hitting the engine directly with an unexploded 1,000-pound bomb and strafed it with 30mm. The SBS did a textbook assault on the ship, but all they found were some elderly fishermen who practically hugged and thanked them since they were sinking and had no working lifeboat. All but one of the trawler men were found to be genuine fishermen. It was a younger-looking man who turned out to be an Argentine naval intelligence officer. In parallel with treating the captured fishermen like kings, they were given sailors' berths and the crew pulled together to donate 100 cigarettes and a porno mag to each man. Invincible also looked after the lieutenant commander of Argentine Naval Intelligence in a manner befitting an officer. He was convinced that having been captured in a war zone in a spy ship and not in uniform, he was destined to be taken to the quarterdeck and shot as a spy. He asked for permission to write a last letter home to his wife and children, and to keep him happy, his request was granted. The captain, J.J. Black, wondered how he was going to convince the man that he wasn't for the chop. Then he had a brainwave. I know what. We'll send the Roman Catholic padre down to see him. He's sure to believe a man of the cloth. One side of the padre, however, convinced him he was about to be executed. It took him several days of needless worry to realize he was in civilized hands. A visiting officer from the War Office noticed one particular instructor, a middle-aged man, who seemed to have masterly powers. He turned to the accompanying LDV officer. That one of your people? Yes, sir. Looks as if he's done some soldiering before. Yes, sir. Knows his job? Yes, sir. What was he? Regimental Sergeant Major Grenadier Guards. On one occasion, a visiting brigadier observed a lengthy row of ribbons on the chest of a private soldier volunteer. He stopped in front of him and said somewhat patronizingly, "Well, my man, you seem to have seen a lot of fighting. Tell me, my man, which campaign did you enjoy most?" The private thought for a moment and then said, "I think, sir, it was the one in which I was second in command to Allenby. In one particular battalion, the explosives officer is a tall, powerful, rosy-cheeked parish minister. He is equally at home with the Old Testament or new grenades, and his parishioners have sometimes been seen to hold their breaths while their spiritual advisor plays about negligently with gun cotton and instantaneous fuse. In the early days, we had orders to stop everybody we saw after dark on the downs and ask for their identity card. On our first night, we came across a couple in a car, and as they were stole away on the approach of our armed party, our leader held them up, demanded their ID cards, and said to the man, 'Do you know you have been in a prohibited area?' 'No, he hasn't,' snapped the girl. One tough little fellow who had lost his son at Dunkirk turned up at every patrol with a Gurkha knife, which as a memento of the last war. This was in a mining village in Lancashire. A farmer claimed he would require no training whatsoever, as having gone out to face a mad bull alone and having killed it with his first shot, he was quite capable of dealing with any jerry within sight. In the context of a training exercise between Home Guard volunteers and the Army, the actual day was kept secret, though the intelligence service were on their toes. Soon soldiers on foot and in cars were seen snooping around the village, examining approaches and asking leading questions. The inhabitants quickly poured forth an astonishing amount of inaccurate information, while the village children shadowed the soldiers with maddening persistence. Fifth columnist appeared. One was knocked out by the village fast bowler getting him in the face with a sand bomb, and the cartload of spies thought they could deceive an agricultural village by driving a cart loaded with hay in the middle of August and pulled by a foreign horse. It was unfortunate for the officer, concerned that he had never learned the scout trick of looking above eye level, and therefore, while he was explaining to his platoon their plan of attack with imagining and zeal out of sight of the village, he failed to notice the small wolf cub in the tree directly above him. No sooner had his earnest officer withdrawn with his men when the boy slid down and lit out for his home and father, and breathlessly, but with much detail, recited his piece. At 2100 hours, the enemy launched his main attack to the center. They came under fire, blanks, from the home guard flanks and center, but came in without any pause towards the Oast houses, where they were to billet for the night. Nothing would stop them. The umpire was unheeded. The casualties advanced even farther than the rest of the attackers, and their standing corn, out of bounds, was about to be entered. The Home Guard commander acted instantly. It was no use firing blanks, so Northover projectors were loaded up with green apples as hard as stones and fired into the advancing enemy. Molotov bottles were thrown high into the air, and the platoon commander burst them one after another with a 12-bore game gun and number 8 shot. The light wind carried the smoke directly into the advancing enemy. The enemy's right flank was under fire from Northover projectors firing apples. Their left flank was receiving potatoes, and they were met in front by a blinding smokescreen accompanied by broken glass and a few stray shot pellets. It marked the end of a perfect summer day, and they surrendered. I heard a story about my grandmother from when she worked a desk job in D.C. during World War II as a secretary. Some general or something came in out of uniform and wanted to go see whoever's office she was the secretary for. And being in civilian clothes, he didn't have proper ID. She told him to pound sand, and he got increasingly irate, swearing up and down that he's a 4-star general and he's killed 50 men, and he'll have her job, yada yada yada. And eventually left steaming mad because my stubborn cunt of a grandma wouldn't let him in. Later that day, he came back in full uniform, apologized profusely, and thanked her for doing her job correctly. The only part of the story that I really believe is how stubborn she was being. God bless you, Gertrude. On 18 July 1944, during a strategy conference in the Wolfschanze, a fly began buzzing around the room, allegedly landing on Hitler's shoulder, and on the surface of a map several times. Irritated, Hitler ordered Darges to dispatch the nuisance. Darges suggested that, as it was an airborne pest, the job should go to the Luftwaffe adjutant, Nicholas von Below. Hitler took Darges aside, dismissed him on the spot, and had him transferred to the Eastern Front. Cheng Li was a Giga-based admiral in the USN, and he was given a job making sure that naval security was up to wartime standards, which he took to ridiculous degrees. He got a second desk which he used exclusively to make increasingly ridiculous identity papers with shit like actresses and Axis leaders on it to try and sneak into naval facilities, including at least 2 tries where he dressed up in a Hitler mustache and got into secured facilities. Then the guys on security would get pulled into a meeting in front of their boss and would have to go through this humiliating conversation like, "Hello, Mr. Anon. I must say I am very flattered you think I'm so pretty. What do I mean? Oh, I walked right past you with an ID naming me as Rita Hayworth with a picture of her taken from a magazine. So either you think I'm as pretty as Rita Hayworth, or you are failing to perform your duties as a guard. Which is it, Mr. Anon?" It was during the end of the Cold War, but the whole Whiskey on the Rocks saga reads like a comedy rather than a serious international incident. From the Russians declaring that they had a crash due to equipment malfunctions after allowing Swedish naval officers to inspect their perfectly functional instruments, to the Swedes calling the Russians bluff and declaring the vessel salvage. Then getting so spooked they launched 2 full squadrons of fighter bombers armed with ASMs who came moments away from engaging what turned out to be German freighters. Every time I read it, I can't help but smile. Never forget that started as a fistfight until some faggot Yank MP shot an Aussie soldier dead. Maybe the Australians should have acted civilized instead of raging out like the simple animals they claim not to be. So you're defending the US heroes? The Australian women sure were.